In the heart of Kentucky, a farmhouse once stood where babies laughed before they cried, and the echoes of their joy never faded, they only learned to hide beneath the floorboards. A century later, when the laughter returned through radio static, the world finally understood that the Bellweathers had never left. They had only been waiting to be heard again. The story opens in rural Kentucky, 1852. The land was green and endless, the kind that rolled like an ocean frozen in time. At the edge of Black Hollow Road stood a white farmhouse, clean and unassuming, its paint still bright against the wild earth. The Bellweathers had come from Virginia, drawn westward by the promise of richer soil and quieter living. They arrived in a wagon heavy with furniture, a cradle, and a family Bible wrapped in cloth. To outsiders, they were the image of decency, God-fearing, hard-working, respectable. But in towns like that, reputations could rot faster than fruit. From the beginning, the land didn't welcome them. The air there felt thick, like it remembered too much. Locals said nothing grew right in Black Hollow. Corn turned yellow before the harvest, wells went dry without warning, and even the birds kept their distance. Most telling of all, not a single crow perched on the Bellwether's fence. It was as if the farm itself exhaled something that made nature hold its breath. Mary Bellweather, young and devout, spent her mornings scrubbing the porch and humming hymns, though her songs were often drowned by the wind that never seemed to stop howling through the valley. Her husband, Samuel, worked the fields with a steady hand, but neighbors swore they saw him sometimes just standing there, pitchfork in hand, staring toward the woods that bordered the property, as if he were waiting for something to step out. Then came the birth. It was early spring, storm season, when thunder rolled like cannons through the hills. The midwife, a woman named Hester Crane, was the only one brave enough to travel the muddy road to the Bellwether home that night. She found Mary in labor, the candles flickering so violently they left shadows that danced along the walls. When the baby came, it was silent for a moment, too long a moment. Hester leaned in close, ready to slap its back, to force that first gasp of life. But before she could touch it, the newborn opened its eyes and laughed. It wasn't a cry, not even close. It was soft and bubbling, almost joyous, but the sound chilled everyone in the room. Mary wept from exhaustion. Samuel crossed himself, though his hand shook. Hester backed away, muttering a prayer under her breath. The laughter faded, replaced by the baby's normal whimpering, but the damage was done. By morning, the storm had passed, and the Bellwether's lantern burned low in the window. Hester never spoke of what she'd seen, though she told her husband she'd never deliver another child in that house. In town, whispers began to spread of a family who'd brought something strange with them from the east, of a baby whose first breath wasn't a cry, but a laugh. And in the days that followed, when people passed the Bellwether farm, they swore they could hear it again, faint, carried on the wind, the sound of a child laughing where no one stood. The rain began just before midnight, a slow patter that turned to a roar as the wind rose and the night split with thunder. Inside the Bellwether farmhouse, the air smelled of sweat, candle smoke, and fear. Mary's cries echoed through the narrow halls, swallowed by the storm outside. Samuel paced the floorboards, his boots leaving muddy prints that trailed from the door to the bedside. The midwife, Hester Crane, worked in silence, her weathered hands trembling as she prepared towels and hot water. Every flash of lightning turned the room stark and white, as if God himself was taking pictures of what he should never have to see. Mary was early, too early. The birth pains had come on sudden, gripping her so hard she couldn't breathe. The oak tree outside, the one Samuel swore had stood for 100 years, split clean down the middle that night, struck by lightning so bright it lit the sky blue. Hester took it as a bad omen, though she dared not say it aloud. The old woman had delivered many babies in her lifetime, but none under a storm that felt like it was trying to tear the heavens apart. When the child finally came, the room went still. No one spoke. No one breathed. The storm seemed to pause, as if even the sky waited for the sound that should come next, that sharp, wet cry of a newborn claiming its place in the world. But instead, there was silence. A long, awful silence that stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. Hester leaned forward, hands reaching to coax life from the tiny, still body. And then it laughed. Not a coo, not a cry, but a bubbling, gurgling laugh, the sound of something delighted to exist when it shouldn't have been. The noise was so wrong it made the air feel colder. Hester froze where she knelt, her mouth open in shock. The candle flames flickered violently, and Mary, drenched in sweat, whispered the only prayer she could remember. Samuel took a step back, his face pale as chalk, as though the sight before him wasn't his child, but a trick of the storm. The baby's laughter filled the room for several seconds before it stopped. Then, at last, came the first cry, high and thin, almost normal, but no one felt relief. Hester crossed herself again, and muttered something about backward births, though she couldn't explain what that meant. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes glassy, and then she fainted clean to the floor. By morning, the storm had moved on, but the house still smelled of iron and ash. Mary slept fitfully, her child swaddled beside her, its small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of dreams. Yet Samuel swore that just before dawn, as he stood watch over them, he heard it again, a soft, muffled giggle from inside the cradle. A laugh that didn't belong to any child he'd ever known. By the summer of 1853, the Bellweathers had settled into a rhythm that seemed, on the surface, ordinary. The fields around their home grew thick with corn, and the white paint on the farmhouse, though already peeling, still gleamed faintly under the Kentucky Sunday. Yet for all the signs of normalcy, there was something about the Bellweathers that kept the neighbors uneasy. They were polite, yes, but distant, too distant. Mary rarely came to town, and when she did, she kept her eyes lowered and her gloves tight around her wrists, as if hiding bruises or secrets that the Lord himself hadn't the right to see. Samuel handled most business in silence, paying in cash, answering questions with the barest nods. No one could say they ever truly knew the Bellweathers. They didn't attend church, claiming the road was too long, the weather too poor, or the children too young. But that excuse began to wear thin. In a place where Sunday service was both religion and social law, their absence became a wound in the community's routine. Gossip filled the gap. Some said Samuel was ill, others whispered he'd lost his faith. But the darker stories, those told only after dark, claimed the family had found something stronger than faith, something that made them prefer the company of shadows. At night, the house on Black Hollow Road changed. The shutters were drawn tight, the lamps dimmed, yet faint sounds drifted from within. Not the twang of a fiddle or the clatter of dishes, but music, if it could be called that. It was soft and lilting, almost like a lullaby sung through a hollow reed. Neighbors described it as beautiful at first, then unsettling. It came in waves, sometimes accompanied by faint thuds or whispered laughter, the kind of laughter that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Once, a boy passing by after dusk claimed he saw light flickering through the cracks of the shutter's red light, pulsing like breath. He said he heard voices, but not words, and that one of them was a baby's giggle that never seemed to end. His father called him a liar and whipped him for it, but the boy refused to walk that road again. The Bellweathers themselves acted as though nothing was wrong. By day, Samuel worked the fields in silence, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, while Mary lingered near the windows, humming softly, her head tilted as if listening to something distant. The children were pale and quiet, their smiles too perfect, their laughter too rehearsed. Over time, the neighbors stopped visiting. Deliveries were left at the gate. Letters went unanswered. The Bellweather home became a world unto itself, a silent island in the midst of farmland and rumor. But on still nights, when the wind carried right, the valley would fill with that strange hollow music, once more rising and falling like a human breath. Those who heard it swore it wasn't played at all. It was times sung, times from somewhere deep beneath the house. Dr. Edwin Sloan had been practicing medicine in Franklin County for nearly 20 years, and in that time, he had seen all manner of sickness, fevers, births gone wrong, injuries from farm tools or drink. But nothing could have prepared him for the Bellweather home on Black Hollow Road. The summons came one rainy afternoon in late October. A farmhand from the property had ridden hard into town, soaked to the bone, claiming one of the Bellweather children had fallen ill. Sloane hesitated at first. Everyone knew that family was touched by something strange. But a doctor's oath was a heavy thing, and by dusk he was on his horse, riding into the thickening fog that gathered over the valley. When he reached the farmhouse, it looked deserted. No light in the windows, no sound but the creak of the barn doors shifting in the wind. The fields were overgrown, the rows of corn blackened at the edges as though singed by frost. He knocked once, then again. Finally, the door opened, and Mary Bellweather stood there in a faded blue dress, her eyes red from sleeplessness. She didn't greet him with words, only a nod, and led him inside. The air in the house was wrong, too warm, too still, every curtain drawn tight, the smell of iron and milk heavy in the air. The doctor followed her through the narrow hall to a room where the child lay. At first glance, the boy seemed asleep, his small chest rising and falling, but when Sloane leaned closer, he saw that the child's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. The pupils reflected the lamplight so clearly that Sloane saw his own face staring back at him. When he placed a hand on the boy's wrist, the pulse was steady, but faint, too faint for life, too strong for death. Mary said nothing, only whispered that the others were downstairs. Thinking she meant more sick children, Sloane followed her down a narrow staircase at the back of the kitchen. The steps creaked beneath his boots, and a draft carried the faintest sound of movement. When they reached the bottom, he stopped cold. The cellar was lined with wooden cradles, dozens of them, each one rocking gently as if stirred by invisible hands. The air was damp, the stone walls glistening with moisture. From somewhere in the darkness, he heard a soft giggle, followed by another and another, until the room seemed to breathe laughter. He turned to Mary, but she was no longer beside him. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that looked like hands reaching across the floor. Then, a voice, a child's, came from the far corner, quiet and clear. "Don't wake them, doctor." Sloane stumbled backward, dropping his bag, and fled up the stairs, bursting through the front door into the cold night air. By the time he reached town, his face was ashen, his clothes damp with sweat. He spoke little of what he'd seen, only that he would not return, not to the house, not to that road, not to anything bearing the Bellweather name. Within the week, he packed his belongings, shuttered his practice, and left Kentucky altogether. Those who saw him last said he looked like a man who'd seen the face of God and found it smiling back at him. The first sighting came just before sunrise, when the fog still clung to the stalks like breath. A field hand named Arlen Briggs was walking the edge of the Bellweather property, inspecting the boundary fence, when he saw movement among the rows of corn. At first he thought it was animals, foxes maybe, or those wild dogs that sometimes wandered down from the hills. But then he saw them clearly. Small shapes, human, moving slow and deliberate through the rows. Children. Barefoot, their clothes thin and gray, their faces turned toward the ground as though they were searching for something they'd lost. Arlen called out, his voice cutting through the mist, but they didn't answer. They stopped moving, and then, as one, they lifted their heads and looked toward him. Even through the fog, he could see their faces white as flour, their eyes black and glossy like river stones. They smiled at him, all at once. The same perfect smile, the kind that should have been comforting but wasn't. He backed away, his boot catching on a root, and when he looked up again, they were gone. He told no one that first day, not wanting to be mocked, but the next morning, another worker swore he saw the same thing. Then another. By the end of the week, no one would go near the Bellweather fields after dawn. The men said they'd see figures weaving through the corn, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes crawling on hands and knees. One man claimed he saw them digging, their small fingers tearing into the earth like animals. Samuel Bellweather brushed off the talk, insisting it was just children from neighboring farms, but everyone knew no family within miles would let their little ones near that land. Too many strange things had already happened there. The livestock were restless, hens stopped laying, and every night, that strange hollow music drifted from the house again, weaving through the corn like mist. One evening, Arlen gathered his courage and went back, lantern in hand. The fields were dead silent except for the creak of the stalks in the wind. He called out again, and for a moment nothing answered. Then the corn began to rustle not from one place, but from everywhere, all around him. The laughter came next, light and bubbling, the same sound every man in that valley now dreaded. He dropped his lantern and ran, not stopping until he reached the road. By morning, when the men returned to retrieve the lantern, they found it still burning at the edge of the field. Around it were dozens of small footprints pressed deep into the mud circling it, overlapping each other, too many to count. And though the corn was still, the men swore they heard it then. Faint giggling rising from the rows, like children playing hide and seek in a place where no children should be. By the winter of 1853, Mary Bellweather no longer resembled the bright, soft-spoken woman who had arrived from Virginia. Her face had grown thin, her eyes hollow and ringed in sleepless purple. The neighbors, few as they were, said she moved differently now, slow, careful, as though listening for something that only she could hear. The children, once seen playing in the yard, had vanished from sight altogether. The curtains stayed drawn, the house dark even at midday. But those who lived close swore they still heard her voice in the fields at dusk, calling names that had no answers. It was near the creek that they saw her most often. She'd wander there barefoot, her dress soaked to the knees, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Sometimes she would kneel and whisper to the water, as if it could listen, as if it could understand. One neighbor, an old trapper, said he once crept close enough to hear her words. "You can take one," she murmured, voice trembling. "Just leave the others be." He never went near her again. Inside the house, things were worse. The few who had reason to visit the milkman, a messenger from town, said the air inside was damp, heavy, and smelled faintly of rust. The floors creaked with strange rhythm, as if something moved just beneath the boards. Mary claimed it was rats. Samuel said nothing. But one night, the preacher from town came calling, after word reached him that Mary had been speaking to things unseen. Reverend Hale found her seated in a rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the floor. She greeted him politely, offered tea, but her hands trembled so violently that the cup rattled against the saucer. He spoke softly, asking if she'd been sleeping, if perhaps the isolation had worn on her. At first, she smiled and said it was nothing, just imagination, just dreams. But then her voice shifted, low and distant. "It's the floorboards," she said. "They whisper at night, they know my name now." The Reverend tried to pray with her, but as he bowed his head, he swore he felt a vibration beneath his boots, a faint tapping from under the floor. It came in patterns, almost like breathing. He finished the prayer quickly and fled before dusk, claiming afterward that the air in that house felt thick with something that wasn't grief, but hunger. Days later, a storm washed through the valley, flooding the creek. Neighbors said they saw Mary there again, standing in the rising water, the bundle gone from her arms. She was whispering something into the current, her voice too faint to hear, before she turned and walked home through the rain. That night, the laughter started again, soft at first, then echoing through the walls of the Bellweather farmhouse, high and bright, like the sound of babies playing in the dark. Reverend Thomas Cole was a man of conviction, a preacher who'd served the county for nearly 2 decades without ever once losing his composure in the pulpit. He'd buried the dead, baptized the living, and comforted the grieving through plagues, droughts, and wars. but nothing in his years of ministry prepared him for the Bellweather home. The congregation had pleaded with him for weeks to go. Mothers whispering that their children woke screaming at night, farmers claiming they heard laughter from the cornfields when no one was there. One even said he saw light glowing from beneath the Bellweather house, as if the earth itself were on fire. Reverend Cole hesitated. He'd heard the stories too, but he dismissed them as superstition, the kind of hysteria that festers in small towns. Still, the pleading grew louder, and by late March he could no longer ignore it. The road to Black Hollow was quiet that morning. Mist hung low, muffling the world, and the Reverend's horse seemed reluctant to continue. When he reached the farmhouse, the fields were still, the house dark but not empty. He knocked once. The door opened slowly, without a hand touching it. Inside, the air felt wrong, humid, close, heavy with something sweet and rotten. He called out, announcing himself, but no answer came, only the faint creak of wood beneath his feet. Mary Bellweather appeared at the top of the staircase, her hair loose, her eyes distant. "You came," she said softly, as if surprised. The Reverend told her he was there to bless the house, to cleanse it of whatever might be troubling her. She smiled faintly. "It's not the house," she whispered. "It's underneath." He followed her through the kitchen, down a narrow hallway that ended at a door half hidden behind a curtain. When she opened it, a draught spilled out cold, damp, smelling faintly of iron. The Reverend hesitated, but Mary only nodded for him to continue. He descended alone, candle trembling in his hand. What he saw below would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cellar was filled with cradles, dozens of them, some still rocking, though no breeze stirred. Inside each lay something pale, wrapped in linen, silent, but moving ever so slightly, as though breathing. He stepped closer and froze. Their faces were turned upward, glassy-eyed, each one smiling. A low sound began to rise then, not laughter, not crying, but a hum soft and wet, echoing through the stone walls. It was a lullaby, sung by many voices at once. Reverend Cole dropped the candle and stumbled back up the stairs. The flame snuffed in an instant. He burst into the daylight gasping, his hands shaking violently. He said nothing to Mary, nothing to Samuel, nothing at all. He simply mounted his horse and rode until he saw the steeple of his church. The next morning, he stood before his congregation, pale as ash. His sermon made no sense, scripture jumbled with fragments of prayer and fevered warning. He spoke of children who never belonged to this world, and a mother who opened the wrong door. He didn't finish. His voice broke, his Bible slipped from his grasp, and he left the pulpit without another word. By the end of the week, Reverend Thomas Cole was gone. He left behind his collar, his home, and a letter no one could read without trembling. It ended with only one line, asterisk. The laughter is not human, asterisk. By the summer of 1854, the Bellweather house had gone nearly silent from the outside, but those who ventured close swore it wasn't empty. The curtains remained drawn, the windows filmed with grime, and the fields had grown wild with untended corn. Travelers who passed along Black Hollow Road said they sometimes saw the faint glow of lanterns moving behind the shutters long after midnight, followed by a sound that froze their blood, the laughter of children. Not the shrill cry of play or the giggle of innocence, but something softer, hollow, like the echo of laughter from down a well. At first, the sound was faint enough to dismiss. The neighbors thought perhaps the Bellweather children played late into the night, or maybe the wind had found a way to mimic something human as it passed through the eaves. But as weeks passed, the laughter grew louder. It came at odd hours, usually after the moon rose, drifting across the valley in waves that carried far beyond the Bellweather property. People began waking in the dark, convinced they heard it just outside their windows, a chorus of small voices, laughing without breath. One night, a woman named Clara Dunsby swore she heard it from inside her own house. She had gone to bed late, her husband already asleep beside her, when the sound began, a soft giggling, faint at first, then rising until it filled the room. She lit her lamp and saw the curtains flutter, though the windows were shut. The laughter seemed to come from the walls themselves, moving from one corner to the next, circling her like a game. She clutched her Bible and began to pray, but the sound only deepened, layered with something else, tiny footsteps, like bare feet padding across wooden floors. When her husband woke, the noise stopped. The next morning she found small handprints on the inside of the window pane, pressed into the condensation. Stories like hers spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. No one wanted to pass the Bellweather farm anymore, not even in daylight. The mailman refused to deliver letters, the milkman left his goods at the far end of the road, and the preacher's replacement, some young man from out of town, lasted only a week before leaving without explanation. Samuel Bellweather was seen less and less. Some said he'd fallen ill, others that he'd gone mad. Mary still appeared at times, wandering the yard with her shawl pulled tight, murmuring softly to the ground as though soothing a child. Those who dared listen claimed they could hear laughter respond to her from beneath the porch. By autumn, the sound had become part of the land itself. When the wind blew through the fields, the cornstalks rustled in rhythm, as if answering an invisible song. On still nights, the laughter would roll out across the valley and bounce from the hills, a ghostly harmony that never quite faded. People began to say it wasn't the Bellweather children laughing anymore. It was the house, and it was learning to enjoy itself. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the hills like a black curtain pulled across the sky. By dusk, the wind had turned violent, the rain striking the valley in sheets that blurred the trees into shadows. The creek that cut through Black Hollow swelled until it burst its banks, carrying branches, fences, and whole sections of the road downstream. The Bellweather farmhouse stood at the heart of it all, dark against the flashes of lightning, unmoving as if anchored by the weight of what it held inside. By midnight, the water had reached the porch, churning with mud and debris. Neighbors, from the safety of higher ground, claimed they saw something glimmer in the stormlight, a faint red glow seeping from the cracks in the Bellweather windows. No one dared go down to see. The valley roared all night with the sound of rain and rushing water, and when dawn came, the land looked as though it had been scoured clean. The flood left behind silence, no birds, no insects, just the steady drip of water from the broken branches and the hollow echo of emptiness. When the townsfolk finally ventured down from the ridge to assess the damage, they found the lower fields buried under a thick layer of silt and debris. Fences were gone, trees uprooted, and the Bellwether's barn had collapsed under the weight of the storm. Yet the farmhouse still stood, grim and untouched, its paint streaked gray with mud. Samuel and Mary were nowhere to be seen. Their door hung half open, swinging gently with the wind. Down by the creek, where the current had gouged a new path through the soil, the men found a wooden cradle, half submerged in mud. It was old, older than the Bellwether's youngest child, and carved with strange patterns that looked almost like runes. The wood was waterlogged, soft to the touch, but what made the men step back wasn't its age. It was the marks, rows of small, perfect indentations along the rim, as if teeth had bitten down again and again. One of the men, Elias Pike, tried to lift it, but the cradle wouldn't budge at first. It was heavy, anchored by something beneath the mud. When they finally pulled it free, they saw that the underside had been hollowed out and lined with thin strands of hair, pale and matted, knotted together like a nest. The cradle was empty, but the men swore they could still hear a faint sound, something between a sigh and a giggle carried on the wind that drifted from the house above. That night, the cradle was taken into town for safekeeping, though none of the men would agree to store it in their homes. It was left in the church shed, covered in canvas. But by morning, the canvas was gone, the cradle's legs caked in fresh mud, and muddy footprints, small, childlike ones, led from the door straight back toward Black Hollow. After that flood, the Bellweather land never truly dried. The ground stayed soft, the creek whispered at night, and from time to time, people said they saw something rocking gently in the fields under the moonlight, a wooden shape half buried in the mud, moving as if soothed by invisible hands. Elias Dunn arrived in Franklin County on a humid evening in late August, his notebook already half full of ghost stories and small-town legends gathered from the backroads of Kentucky. He was a man of curiosity rather than courage, a writer for a Louisville paper that paid him to chase whispers and print them as history. He'd covered houses that moaned in the wind, graveyards where lights flickered, and family curses that died with their tellers. But the name Bellweather had followed him from tavern to tavern like a chill. Even men who laughed at superstition lowered their voices when they spoke of that farmhouse on Black Hollow Road. He rented a room at the boarding house near the edge of town, spending his first days interviewing locals. Their stories differed in detail but agreed in dread. They spoke of laughter in the fields, of windows that glowed red like embers, of children's shadows seen against curtains when no child had lived there in years. The flood, they said, had unearthed something that should have stayed buried. Elias wrote every word carefully, noting their trembling hands and darting eyes. To him, fear was good copy. On his third night, he went to see the house for himself. He carried a lantern, a flask of whiskey, and the bravado of a man who didn't yet believe. The moon was low, barely cutting through the mist that hung over the valley. The Bellweather place appeared slowly, its roofline sharp against the dark horizon. The front gate hung broken. The grass was high, brushing his knees as he walked the path toward the porch. He paused only once when he thought he heard a child humming somewhere close, but the sound melted into the wind. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. His lantern threw light across the hallway, illuminating portraits whose faces had faded into smudges. In the corner, a cradle sat perfectly still. He stepped closer and saw it move not a sway from the floorboards, but a deliberate, slow rock. Elias froze. Then, faintly, a sound came from above. It was laughter, soft, bright, and distant, like children playing in a room far away. He called out, but the laughter stopped instantly, as if it had been listening. The silence that followed was suffocating. He felt the air shift, as though the walls themselves had inhaled. And then he saw it, the faintest red glow blooming from beneath the floorboards, spreading upward through the cracks, pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't fire. It was colder, steadier, as if the house itself were lit from within by something that couldn't burn out. Elias left in a hurry, stumbling into the night with his lantern swinging wildly. Back in his rented room, he wrote until dawn, his handwriting uneven, his words fragmented. His final entry read, Asterisk, the Bellweather home breathes. Its light is not of flame but of memory. I have seen the laughter, they wear it like a mask. Do not go near when the fields are singing. Asterisk. The boarding house keeper found his notebook 3 days later. Elias Dunn was gone. His horse still tied outside, his bag untouched, his bed unslept in. Some said he ran, frightened out of his wits. Others swore they saw a flicker of light down in Black Hollow that week, one that pulsed softly, as if another lantern had joined the ones that never went out. By 1855, the town's schoolhouse kept records as diligently as the church kept graves. It was there, in a dusty ledger of names and dates, that Miss Abigail Carter first noticed something strange. 5 Bellweather children were listed: Eliza, Jonah, Clara, Ruth, and Thomas, but only 3 were marked as living. There were no burial records for the missing 2, no death certificates, no mention of illness or accident. When Miss Carter asked around, she found no one in town could recall a funeral, not even a whispered mourning bell. It was as though the children had simply vanished. When she visited the Bellweather farm to inquire, the walk itself unsettled her. The air grew colder near the property, the sound of insects fading until there was only the crunch of her shoes against the dirt path. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its roofline sagging beneath years of weather. She knocked 3 times before Samuel Bellweather opened the door. His face was drawn, his eyes dull and rimmed red. He smiled, but it wasn't a greeting, It was the tired stretch of a man pretending not to understand the question he knew was coming. Miss Carter explained her concern, the missing names, the confusion over the records. Samuel stood in silence for a long moment, glancing toward the staircase behind him, as though listening for something. Then he said, quietly but without hesitation, "They're still with us, just quieter now." The school teacher didn't know how to respond. Samuel closed the door before she could ask another word. When she returned to town, she told the clerk that the Bellweather family was peculiar and left it at that. But in the weeks that followed, more people began to wonder. A peddler passing through claimed he saw children's faces peering from the attic window late one night, pale and still, their eyes catching the moonlight like mirrors. Another neighbor swore he heard soft singing drifting from the cornfield, 5 voices, rising and falling in harmony, though only 3 children were said to remain alive. No one dared confront the family again, but the unease grew. The laughter that once drifted from the farmhouse had changed. It came less often now, softer, slower, like the breath of something falling asleep. And when it did come, it was never just one child's voice. It was layered high and low, near and far, as though coming from inside the walls themselves. By autumn, the school records were quietly amended. The 2 missing Bellweather children were crossed out, their names left without note or reason. Miss Carter, shaken by something she refused to describe, resigned her position and moved east before winter. The following spring, the Bellweather farm stood even more silent than before. But sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, travelers along Black Hollow Road claimed they saw movement in the windows, small silhouettes, standing side by side, watching, their outlines flickering like candlelight. 5 shapes, always 5. The Bellweather farmhouse had been falling apart for years. The once white siding had grayed to the color of ash, and the porch sagged under its own weight. After the flood, rot had crept into the wood like a slow infection, spreading from the foundation up through the walls. By 1856, the family rarely let anyone inside, but when the roof began to cave near the back of the house, Samuel finally hired a pair of farmhands to make repairs. The men arrived at dawn, uneasy but hungry for pay. One of them, a boy barely 20, named Caleb Ross, was sent to patch the nursery floor. It was there that the house decided to show its true shape. The nursery was small and airless, its single window nailed shut. Dust hung thick as breath, and the smell of damp wood filled the room. Caleb noticed right away how strange it felt, too cold despite the heat outside, too still for a room meant for children. 3 small beds sat neatly against the wall, untouched by time, each covered in a quilt that looked handmade, though the patterns were strange and uneven, like symbols instead of stitches. He stepped carefully across the warped boards until one gave way beneath him with a sound like a gasp. The floor split, and he fell through into darkness, landing hard on packed earth. The air below was damp and heavy, filled with a smell that was not quite death, but close enough to make his stomach turn. He called for help, his voice echoing strangely, as if the space swallowed sound. When his lantern finally flickered to life, the light revealed a room that had not been touched by daylight in years. It wasn't a cellar for food or wine. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat glass jars, dozens of them, each one filled with a cloudy liquid. Caleb stepped closer. Inside the jars floated shapes, small and pale, curled like sleeping animals. Fingers, hands, the faint outline of a face pressed against glass. Some looked like newborns. Others, like pieces of them. He stumbled back, knocking one jar to the floor. It shattered, and the liquid spilled out, thick and sticky, leaving behind something soft that rolled to his boot. When he looked down, he realized it was an ear, no bigger than a coin. He screamed until Samuel came running, but by the time the man reached the room, the shelves were bare. Every jar gone, the dirt floor smooth as if undisturbed. Samuel's face went white. He told Caleb to leave, to forget what he'd seen, and paid him double on the spot. The boy left without a word, riding hard through the night, until the Bellweather farm was miles behind him. Days later, Caleb told his story in town, shaking and pale. No one believed him, not completely. But that week, the house on Black Hollow Road began to glow again at night, and the sound of laughter drifted from beneath the nursery floor. It wasn't the laughter of children anymore. It was softer, slower, as if something small and many-voiced was learning to breathe. By the fall of 1856, the nights in Black Hollow grew long and restless. The air turned colder than it should have for that time of year, and the mist seemed to linger even when the sun was high. The Bellweather farmhouse sat quiet, its windows boarded, its fields overgrown with twisted corn that never ripened. But as the rest of the valley tried to forget the family, the woods behind their property refused to stay silent. It began with the wind, how it changed its tune. Then came the singing. The first to hear it was a trapper named Owen Reed. He'd set snares along the creek one evening and was returning home when he caught the faintest sound drifting through the trees. At first, he thought it was a woman's voice, soft, low, humming something that could have been a lullaby. The melody was familiar yet wrong, each note just slightly off, like a hymn sung backward. He stopped to listen, lantern held high, and the sound seemed to come closer. When the wind shifted, he realized it wasn't one voice. It was many. Dozens, maybe more, weaving in and out of one another in eerie harmony. Owen said later that the song made his bones ache. Not from fear, but from something deeper, older, a sadness that felt almost alive. He dropped his lantern and ran, leaving it burning at the edge of the creek. When he returned for it at dawn, the light was gone, and all that remained was the faint sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Others began to hear it soon after. Farmers working late claimed to hear lullabies rising from the Bellweather woods just after sunset. Some described it as beautiful, others unbearable. The melody changed from night to night, but the feeling it carried stayed the same, an ache that settled into the chest and didn't leave until morning. A few who dared to follow the sound swore they saw small figures moving between the trees, pale as moonlight, their mouths open in song though no breath escaped them. The music never came from one place. It seemed to circle whoever listened, sometimes behind them, sometimes ahead, always near, but never close enough to see. When townsfolk tried to pray over the land, the singing grew louder, almost mocking, the harmony swelling until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. After that, no one lingered near Black Hollow after dark. The road that led past the Bellweather house grew over with weeds, and even the bravest refused to walk it once the sun dipped below the hills. But on clear nights, when the wind was still, the valley carried the song far, so far that people miles away claimed to hear it in their dreams. And always, just before the melody faded, there came a single note high, trembling, and unmistakably human that broke into laughter before the silence returned. The fire started just before dawn, on the first frost of October. The valley was cloaked in mist when the smoke began to rise from the Bellweather farm, thick and black, curling into the pale morning sky like a signal to something watching from above. The flames consumed the barn in near silence, as if the wind itself refused to fan them. By the time neighbors arrived with buckets and shovels, the structure had already collapsed inward, a glowing heap of ember and ash. The air reeked of wet smoke and something sharper beneath it, something sweet and metallic that clung to the throat long after breathing it in. Samuel Bellweather stood in the yard, bare-chested and barefoot, his face smeared with soot. He said nothing. His eyes didn't follow the fire. He only stared at the field beyond, at the rows of dying corn swaying without wind. When a man from town asked him what happened, Samuel said, "It had to be done," and walked back toward the house. He didn't come out again that day. The sheriff arrived by afternoon, a practical man who didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He brought 2 deputies, though both hesitated before crossing the property line. The ground was still warm beneath their boots, and every so often, the ash would shift on its own, as though something beneath it were breathing. They searched through the wreckage, expecting to find the charred remains of livestock or tools. Instead, they found bones. Not large ones, but small, delicate, perfect. A dozen tiny skulls, arranged in a ring so exact, it looked deliberate. The sheriff called it a cruel trick of the fire, claiming that heat and collapse could make strange patterns, but even he couldn't explain how the skulls had remained unscathed when everything else was reduced to cinders. The men who helped dig through the ruins refused to speak of what they saw after the smoke cleared. Faint footprints pressed into the soot, too small to belong to any living person. That night, the smell of the fire lingered across Black Hollow. Some said it drifted miles, seeping into homes and clothing. Others swore they saw sparks rise from the ashes even after the flames had died, glowing red like tiny lanterns that refused to go out. The next morning, when the sheriff returned to photograph the site, the skulls were gone. The circle remained perfect and undisturbed, but the center of it had been cleared away, smooth as water. In the following days, a haze settled over the valley. The Bellweather farm, already avoided by most, became a place of whispers once more. Those who passed by claimed they heard crackling from the ashes at night, like wood smoldering long after it should have turned cold. Some said they saw shapes moving in the smoke, small figures running in circles, their laughter rising faintly above the hiss of dying fire. Whatever the barn had held, the blaze hadn't destroyed it. It had freed it. By the winter of 1856, little Clara Bellweather had become the most whispered name in Black Hollow. She was the youngest of the Bellweather children, no more than 6 years old, a pale, solemn girl with hair the color of straw and eyes too large for her small face. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it never reached her eyes. The townsfolk said she'd inherited her mother's quietness and her father's distant stare, but there was something else in her, something that made even the most pious cross themselves when she passed. It began with the way she spoke, or rather, how she didn't. For months, Clara hadn't uttered a word. Mary Bellweather told neighbors the child was slow to speak, though everyone knew how early the other Bellweather children had learned to laugh, to sing, to mimic their mother's voice in eerie unison. Then, one morning, Clara began talking again, but nothing she said made sense. Her words came in strange, fluid sounds that twisted backward, like a song played in reverse. Her siblings listened in silence when she spoke, sometimes nodding as though they understood. When Samuel tried to correct her, she only smiled faintly and repeated his name backward. When Clara was sent to the schoolhouse that spring, Miss Abigail Carter agreed to teach her, though not without hesitation. The girl sat at the front of the room, quiet as dust, tracing shapes into the wood of her desk with her fingernail. When the teacher asked her to read, Clara complied, her voice soft and melodic, but the words emerged reversed, letter by letter, as if some unseen hand had flipped them in her throat. At first, the children laughed. Then they stopped. The sound didn't feel like speech, it felt like invocation. The rhythm of it made their ears ache, their skin prickle. Miss Carter tried to correct her. She knelt beside Clara, took her hand, and told her to say good morning. The girl tilted her head and whispered something that sounded like the phrase spoken backward. The teacher blinked, confused, then her eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the floor. The children screamed. By the time help arrived, Miss Carter had woken but would not speak a word about what she'd heard. She resigned that evening and left the county by week's end. After that, no one taught Clara again. She stayed home, wandering the halls of the farmhouse, her faint voice drifting through the open windows at night. Neighbors swore they heard her singing soft, lilting melodies that started normally and ended in garbled syllables that made their teeth ache to hear. Samuel boarded up the nursery soon after. Mary began sleeping downstairs, her Bible clutched so tightly the pages tore. Years later, people said Clara wasn't speaking backward at all. They said she was repeating something that wasn't hers to say, words meant for someone listening beneath the floor. And when the house grew quiet, when the laughter faded, her voice would start again, clear and cold as a child's lullaby turned inside out. By the spring of 1857, the Bellweather name had become a curse whispered in every farmhouse for miles. Children were vanishing across the county, first one from a family near the ridge, then another from a homestead by the creek, and then two more, both seen last near Black Hollow Road. The disappearances followed no pattern of age or place, but every rumor led to the same conclusion. The Bellweather land was taking them. Mothers began keeping their children indoors after dusk, fathers patrolled fields with rifles, and church bells tolled long into the night. Fear moved through the valley like a sickness, quiet and contagious. The sheriff, a man named Ward Latham, was not one to believe in superstition. He'd fought in the war, seen what madness could do to decent men, and didn't scare easy. But after the sixth child vanished, he could no longer dismiss the pattern. The footprints, always small, always leading toward the hollow. The sounds neighbors reported at night: soft laughter in the distance, faint singing that rose and fell with the wind. So, in May of that year, Latham gathered 6 deputies and a minister from the county church, swearing to put an end to the whispers once and for all. They set out at dawn. The morning fog was heavy, thick enough to swallow their horses' legs. When they reached the Bellweather property, the house stood silent, every window boarded, every door locked from within. The cornfields were long dead, stalks brittle and gray. They began their search in the barn's ashes, then the fields, then finally the house. Latham's journal, found later in his desk, described the air inside as choked with a sweetness that clings to the lungs. He noted strange stains on the walls, the smell of rot beneath the floorboards, and the faint sound of something tapping from the cellar below. They pried open the cellar door just before sunset. The minister refused to enter, claiming the air tasted of graves. Latham led the men down, lanterns shaking in their hands. The last words in his report read, "Room beneath the floor deeper than expected, walls covered in." The sentence stopped there. The rest of the page was blank except for a dark smear at the bottom corner, as if the ink had been dragged by a trembling hand. When the deputies' horses returned to town riderless that night, the townsfolk knew something had gone wrong. At dawn, a small search party went to the Bellweather property, but they found no sign of the sheriff or his men. Only his notebook, half buried in the mud near the well, the second page soaked through with something that looked like blood but smelled faintly sweet, like honey left too long in the Sunday. From that day forward, no one entered Black Hollow again. The county sealed the investigation, the church declared the land cursed, and the Bellweather farmhouse was left to rot. But some nights, when the fog was thickest, travelers swore they could see faint lights moving behind its windows, and the sound of small voices rising in the dark singing the same tune the sheriff's men had heard before they vanished. A lullaby, soft and patient, waiting for someone to join in. When the county sent new investigators to the Bellweather property, nearly a month had passed since Sheriff Latham and his men had vanished. No one wanted to go, but orders came from the state capital: too many questions, too many rumors. 4 men rode out from town at dawn, their horses skittish, their faces drawn. By the time they reached Black Hollow, the sun had vanished behind a bank of gray clouds, and the air hung thick and warm despite the season. The house stood exactly as it had before, silent, sunken, its roofline sharp against the hills. Yet something about it seemed different. It leaned forward slightly, like it was listening. The men dismounted slowly. The ground was soft beneath their boots, warm to the touch, as if heat were rising from the earth itself. One of them, a man named Parsons, remarked that he could hear something faint, an irregular sound, too low to be wind. It came from the house, deep and rhythmic. They approached, guns drawn, the air growing heavier with each step. By the time they reached the porch, every one of them was sweating, though the day was cool. The house exhaled, and a faint creak passed through the boards under their feet like the stir of lungs beneath skin. Inside, the air was worse, humid, almost human. Dust motes drifted through a faint golden light that seemed to come from nowhere. The smell of decay was there, but beneath it lay something strangely sweet, almost like warm milk. The men spoke little, too aware of the stillness. When Parsons touched the wall, he jerked his hand back. The wood pulsed beneath his palm, faint but certain. Another man placed his ear against the plaster and swore he heard a heartbeat. They moved deeper, their lanterns flickering as though the air resisted their light. The furniture was still in place, though covered with a fine film of dust. A teacup sat on the table, half full of something that hadn't dried. A single child's shoe rested in the hallway, small and pristine. When they reached the parlor, one of the men pointed to the ceiling. The boards above were expanding and contracting slowly, almost imperceptibly, in rhythm with the faint sound beneath them. The house was breathing. One investigator called out for anyone inside. The house responded with a groan that rippled through the floorboards, a sound so deep it vibrated in their ribs. The lanterns dimmed, and a warm gust of air passed through the room carrying a faint giggle, high and wet, like the echo of a child's laugh underwater. Panic took hold. They fled through the door, stumbling over the porch steps, their horses shrieking as if bitten. When they reached town that night, their faces were gray, and their words disjointed. Two refused to speak at all. Parsons later described the house in one line. It was breathing, and it knew our names. The county sealed the property that winter, boarding the road and posting signs warning trespassers to stay away. But even from a distance, people swore they could hear it, the faint rise and fall of breath drifting across the valley, steady and patient, like the house was alive and waiting for the next knock at its door. It happened on a windless night in late October, when the moon hung low and swollen over Black Hollow. The few neighbors who still lived within sight of the Bellweather farm would later describe the same impossible thing: how, just after midnight, the windows of that long-abandoned house began to glow. It wasn't lamplight or fire, it was red, deep and throbbing, like the inside of a living wound. Every pane pulsed in rhythm, spilling color into the fields and across the trees, until even the sky above the valley seemed to blush. Old Mrs. Wainwright, who lived 2 ridges over, said she saw movement inside the light. Shadows flickering past the curtains, too many to count, small and quick. She swore they weren't human shapes, not exactly, more like things that had forgotten how to be human. The red glow grew brighter until the house looked as if it were burning from within, but no smoke ever rose from the roof. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the light went out, plunging the hollow into complete darkness. No one slept after that. The following morning, 3 men from town rode out to investigate. The air felt heavy, damp, and strangely warm for the season, carrying the faint scent of metal and ash. The front door stood ajar. Inside, the Bellweather house was unnaturally still. The dining table was set for 5. Plates full, bread torn, cups half filled as if supper had been interrupted mid-bite. A single candle burned low, its flame trembling though there was no draught. The men called out, their voices echoing through the empty rooms. No answer came. The floors were covered in dust, yet not a single footprint marked the surface, not even their own, though they clearly saw themselves moving across it. Upstairs, the beds were made, but the blankets bore faint impressions, as though bodies had just risen from them. The smallest room smelled of lavender and smoke. A child's toy lay on the floor, rocking back and forth without touch, until one of the men kicked it aside. Then they noticed the clocks. Everyone in the house, on mantels, in bedrooms, even the pocket watch lying open on the kitchen counter, had stopped at the same moment. 3:17, not a tick beyond. The air inside grew thicker as they searched, each breath harder to draw. By the time they reached the cellar door, their lanterns sputtered out all at once. They left without looking below. By dusk, the news had spread across the valley. The Bellweather family was gone. No bodies, no trace. The sheriff refused to mount another search, claiming some things were better left buried. That night, As the sun dipped below the hills, the house glowed again, just faintly, a soft red heartbeat in the distance. And those who watched swore they heard it breathing, steady and slow, as if the house itself had finally fallen asleep. Decades passed before anyone dared return to Black Hollow. The Bellweather farm was left to the elements, its roof collapsing under storms, its fields overtaken by weeds and silence. The story of the vanished family became more myth than memory, a cautionary tale told to keep children close after dark. But in 1892, long after those who had known the Bellweathers were gone, a new family arrived from Tennessee. The father, a man named Horace Kittrell, was a practical sort, superstitious only about debt and weather. He bought the land cheap, laughing off the locals' warnings about ghosts and cursed ground. He planned to clear the overgrowth and plant tobacco, certain he could turn misfortune into profit. By early spring, he had hired a crew of men to plow the old fields. The first days went smoothly, the air heavy with the scent of new soil and distant rain. But on the third morning, just after dawn, one of the mules stumbled mid-step and refused to move. The plowman cursed, thinking the animal had snagged on a root. When they pulled the blade free, they saw it wasn't a root at all, it was wood, pale, smooth, and buried deep. Curious, the men dug around it until the shape became clear. A cradle, small and delicately carved, its sides worn by time. There was no blanket, no remnants of cloth, only dust. When Horace tipped it over, something faint caught his eye, letters carved along the inside rim, thin and trembling. He brushed away the dirt and saw the word times ha 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 asterisk repeated again and again, as though someone had tried to carve the sound of laughter itself. The men laughed nervously, thinking it a trick of some long-gone child, until the second cradle was found, then a third. By noon, they had unearthed 12 of them, each perfectly preserved despite the decades underground. The carvings were always the same, no names, no dates, only laughter scratched into the wood. The pattern of their placement was strange, too. They weren't scattered by flood or chance. They had been buried deliberately, each one facing the same direction, forming a wide circle that enclosed the field's center. As the men worked, the air grew hotter. The ground began to steam, and the soil took on a faint red hue. One of the workers swore he heard something beneath the earth, a muffled sound, rhythmic, like the breathing of something vast and sleeping. The mules began to bray, their eyes rolling white, and the men fled, leaving their tools where they fell. Horace returned alone that evening, lantern in hand. The cradles were still there, lined neatly in the dying light. He stood for a long while, studying them, until he realized the air around him had gone utterly still. Then, faintly, he heard it, the soft echo of laughter, rising from the open cradles, low at first, then swelling until it filled the field. He dropped his lantern and ran. By morning he was gone, his house abandoned, the mules still tied and frothing at their reins. Years later, travelers who passed through Black Hollow claimed they could still see those small wooden cradles half buried in the dirt, rocking gently even when there was no wind. Some swore they could hear laughter in the tobacco rows, faint and distant, as if the soil itself remembered the children who had never truly left. In the summer of 1952, the Bellweather name had long since faded from public memory, its story buried beneath dust, superstition, and time. Black Hollow had become nothing more than an empty patch of land on the county maps, the farmhouse reduced to a skeletal ruin choked by ivy and vines. Most folks in Franklin County avoided that stretch of road altogether, calling it cursed ground. But to outsiders, it was just another forgotten place, an ideal spot for testing new equipment, far from the noise of civilization. That was how Dr. Warren Heller came to it, a professor from Louisville with a fascination for unexplained radio frequencies and a reputation for chasing ghosts of sound. Heller had been studying a strange phenomenon, low-band transmissions that appeared only at night in certain parts of rural Kentucky, faint whispers of static that seemed to mimic human rhythm. He brought with him a small field recorder, a pair of headphones, and 2 graduate assistants. The 3 men set up their gear on what remained of the Bellweather property near the foundation stones that marked where the house once stood. The night was windless. The air carried no insects, no birds, not even the hum of distant electricity. It was too quiet. They began recording just after midnight. At first, there was nothing but ordinary static, the crackle of interference, the hiss of an empty channel. But around 2 a.m., the signal changed. A faint pulse emerged, repeating every few seconds, steady and deliberate, like the rhythm of breathing. Heller adjusted the frequency, expecting to catch an echo from some far-off transmitter. Instead, the static deepened. Within it, beneath the noise, came another sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A giggle. Then another. The men froze. It was unmistakable children's laughter, faint but clear, rising and falling as though carried by a breeze that didn't exist. The more Heller fine-tuned the dials, the stronger it became. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern, almost like a song. He described it later in his notes. The sound of babies laughing, but too slow, too hollow, as if the joy had been recorded backward. When he slowed the reel to half speed, the laughter changed. It warped into cries, thin, gasping wails that dissolved back into giggles before fading out entirely. For nearly 7 minutes, the recording played like that, laughter twisting into sobs, then vanishing into silence. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the tape cut off on its own. The machine's needles froze. Every clock on their equipment stopped. When morning came, the 3 men packed up quickly and left without speaking. Heller submitted his report to the university, but the department refused to archive the recording. His assistants never returned to school. The tape itself vanished months later, though copies of his written notes survived. The final line in his report read, "It is not interference, it is memory. The ground remembers." Today, the Bellweather land lies quiet again, overgrown and empty. But sometimes, on stormy nights, radio operators in the county still pick up faint bursts of static that don't match any known signal. When slowed down, they say, it sounds almost like children laughing soft and distant right before they begin to cry.